How's it going, guys? And welcome back to another video on the channel. Today, I decided that it would be a good idea to do a fun hypothetical exercise. This being how I would tier the upcoming summer seasonal. Summer seasonal signups went out yesterday. I had this video planned before I knew that seasonal signups were going to be 2 weeks in length. So unfortunately, I don't look like I'm ahead of time. Thanks, Autumn. Well, actually, thanks, Autumn. You're the reason I have a doc to be able to showcase this. And I know she wants this to be like a really big event because this is the potential last seasonal, depending on what way Champions comes out as a video game. So I will leave a link in the description to like the Smogon Draft server and the sign up form for the autumn seasonal. I think I've called it summer at least twice in this intro, but who cares? So I will leave a link for that just in case you manage to stumble across this video and don't know what Smogon Draft is, which I'd say is highly unlikely, but if you did, feel free, I'll leave it down there. Anyways, what you can see on your screen at the minute is the way that the draft board was looking going into DCL3, which would be the most recent rendition of the SV draft board. You can see Iron Valiant sitting there in the 20-point tier by itself. Great Tusk Meow, Terapagos, you see the 17-pointers, 16-pointers. And it's a pretty fine tier list, but I think there is a couple of things that I have issues with. One of them is I think that Terratorn is the best mon in the format, hands down. I do think Valiant being pick 1 isn't necessarily incorrect. I think the issue with Valiant is that it's very easy to mess up a Valiant draft. Whereas with Terratorn, there's so many archetypes out there that should work and lead to Torn being successful. I know that's a little bit ironic to say, given Torn's win rate right now in DCL isn't exactly amazing. But some of those teams did make some decisions that you just shouldn't be doing with Torn. And I think sometimes what can happen with Team Tours is people try to innovate too hard, when sometimes sticking to the tried and tested is better. Which is ironic, seeing as what I said with the Zaru video. But it's a case-by-case basis, guys, okay? Just let me land. So, that is one of my biggest issues. Another issue that I have is I think that there's a serious lack of natural speed. And that leads to a lot of people making decisions that maybe they shouldn't, just for the sake of getting speed. Or just being in a really bad position in regards to their speed tiers. The Terratorn conversation does also bring up the need for potential other Terra captains. And I think there is some Terra captains that have just kind of been left banned that I think you might be better off having legal. And we'll get into them in a sec. And then there's also just a few mid-tier mons that I think are definitely underpriced. And the last thing I want to mention here is mid-tier Terra Captains. Mid-tier Terra Captains should be a point where people try to innovate and find success. Whereas what's happening with mid-tier Terra Captains at the moment is everyone's drafting the same, like, 4 of them. And it's really annoying. Like, well, I say 4. Yeah, it's 4 of them. And let's just say I have seriously taxed all 4. And I think it kind of gives people the decision of, do I go with the same Terramon that I know is good and I know has seen success, or do I try something new? And I think for something like a seasonal, where you have such a wide player base, is the right place to do this. And then if that has success, maybe transfer that over to a team tour. Because I think it's always better to test things out in a seasonal first. Because the seasonal is the biggest event that you can have, where you can actually try things out whilst also having a high level of competition, especially once you kind of get into those later rounds, either like the couple rounds before play-ins or like the bracket stage itself after the Swiss has concluded. So as you can see here, I have a lot of usage stats here. Once again, thank you very much to to Autumn for giving me this. And this amalgamates results from, I believe it's the last 2 DPLs and the last 2 DCLs, as well as seasonal-based stuff. So I had a look through a lot of these. It talks about combinations. It talks about Terra consistency. I also have another SV usage thing, but I probably deleted the wrong one. That's okay, though. But yeah, there's just a lot of interesting stats to just kind of view through here in terms of what has kind of happened a lot, what's just not been touched for a long time. And yeah, really interesting read. Yeah, and then it does go into circuit, both for 2024, and then some spring seasonal stuff from, I believe, play-ins onwards. So, without further ado, I think I've rambled enough in these first 5 minutes of the video, to the point where I think you just want to see what I've managed to come up with. And without further ado, here we are. Now, first things first, you're probably wondering why have I not started with the 20-point tier? That's because it's empty. And there's only 2 mons in that, both of which are Terra Captains, and I'm going to get into them in a second. Because I imagine there's something else that's grabbing your attention. And that would be the legal Zamazenta hero. Now, Zamazenta is a mon that I've used, and I had a horrible time with it. I think it is a brilliant mon for doing 40% of things, but it's raw pow without, say, a boosting item. But it also really regrets having a boosting item, because a lot of the time it'll want something like boots for its own longevity, or it might want Mirror Herb for specific setup scenarios. And yeah, it just kind of struggles, especially with the way that people draft already, with the commonality of a bunch of ghost types that it doesn't even necessarily beat. Petrant being one of them. We'll get to that demon later. I think that Zamazenta might be perfectly okay to allow, while also solving the problem in regards to natural speed, as well as providing another round 1 mon, which I think could be kind of nice. So that is something that I would try out in Seasonal. And you probably are wondering why I haven't put it in 20. I don't think it's better than Valiant or Masquerada. Valiant, all 3 of these I could have put in 20 either, and then just kind of bumped a bunch of stuff up in its own way. But I do think that all of these mons are worse than Terratorn in the current meta. I'm going to be dead honest. So speaking of Terratorn, I might as well address it now. It is one of 2 mons that I have in the 20-point tier. And the other 20-point tier mon that you can see is actually right above it. And that is because I've decided to free Terra Sneasler. Now, I know this is probably a controversial one. And I am going to say this is with the caveat of I would not have Dire Claw legal in this case. I'll get into my opinions on sleep probably to end the video here. But let's just say Dire Claw's banned. I think Terra Sneasler, of all the Terras that are currently banned, I think it's the most healthy one, and I don't think it would be that problematic if you plopped it into the current metagame. I think its best sets would be Scarf or Bandit, depending on speed tiers of your opponent. I think the setup sets just would not be able to get it done 99% of the time because of just the amount of Encore. You know, there's phasing that you have to deal with. It also just doesn't quite have the bulk to be able to get through the things it would want to be able to live the hits to get the setup opportunities. And everyone's drafting Grounded Poison anyways. And Sneasler's not going to run Terra Ground if it doesn't have to. So I think it would be completely fine. This, I know, is probably the most controversial thing I've put in this entire tier list. And if people do have differing opinions, please do let me know. Like, if there's one thing that I want in this comment section, it is actually just to kind of start a bit of a debate about this. I know there's been a lot of debates going back and forth in like the Smogon Draft channel and things like that. So, you know, just kind of put it all together in a place wouldn't be too bad. Also, I should caveat this, the tiers aren't actually live yet, even though the signups are live. I believe they should be coming in the next few days. I have seen them. I have seen some of the suggestions anyways. I kind of saw them just in terms of setting this all up. But I'm not going to spoil anything that's put in that, because that kind of ruins the whole fun of this video, huh? Some of the stuff probably does line up accidentally. I made this all blind myself before I actually looked at that list. Well, some of it. I won't say what was a blind decision and what was not a blind decision. Let's say it that way. So, I don't think Sneasler would be that bad. Obviously, people might be like, like the grassy terrain Sneasler stuff. Yeah, that's really not the problem. The problem would actually be like Scarf Terra fighting close combat, realistically. Or I guess Terra Poison Gunk Shot would do the same thing. Or like a strong neutral Terra Blast into teams that just like don't have good ghost resists, for example. Yeah, maybe, or flying resists might be another one. But they're kind of the sets that I think would probably be the best ones, the way the metagame currently shapes up. So, yeah, that's probably that's the 2 juiciest things out of the way. And I did not think... I think the rest of this isn't too bad. I imagine there's probably something that I'm overlooking here that people are going to be like, how the hell did you do that? But let's just keep going here. Also, if people do think that I should have put the 3 of them into the 20-point tier, let me know. I just didn't... I preferred an empty 20-point tier to an empty 19-point tier. I'm going to be completely honest. We move on to the 18-point tier, and I've decided to move Great Tusk away from the other two. And that is because I think that Great Tusk is definitely worse than Valiant Masquerada. And I think having a point gap to display this is correct. Especially when, like, Great Tusk and Terrapagos obviously are the two best removal options that we have in the format at the minute. And I don't think there's a major gap between them. The way that things have shaped up haven't really suited Tusk a hell of a lot. And for me, I think Terra is something that it genuinely needs to be able to thrive. Regular Great Tusk just doesn't quite have the same gravitas as it did like a year ago, even 6 months ago to an extent. So I think it makes sense for it to drop. It's not as good as Valiant. It's not as good as Masquerada. It's not as good as Torn. And it's not as good as Zamazenta, obviously. In this case. Actually, it might be as good as Zamazenta. That's an interesting conversation. But I think it makes sense to put it with Terrapagos. Terrapagos at 18, yes, it's definitely expensive. But I also think if you put it into the 17-point tier that I have, it definitely stands out too much. So I think 18 makes a lot of sense. The 17-pointer tier, nothing too crazy to report here. The only thing is I have moved Roaring Moon up, and that is because I do think Roaring Moon is on par with Darkrai. And I have moved another Dark type down in its place, which you can see in the 16-point tier, that being Greninja. And that's because Greninja has just fallen behind in the race. Remember a year ago where it was Gren versus Masquerada for best Dark type? And now it's 4th. And yes, it has 2 seasonal wins under its belt as a Terra Captain. Both one because of it and one in spite of it, I think is probably the best way to put that. So I think that it makes sense to drop Greninja down. I did keep it with a point increase to Terra it, or a Terra tax, as you might say. But it was something I debated for quite a while to just leave it as is, because no one's really drafting Terra Greninja anymore. In terms of other notable additions into 16, I have put Lando T here, and that's because Lando T is just doing really well at the minute. It's doing just Lando T things. It's a really good glue for its squad. It is going before Tinglu an awful lot of the time now. You're not quite seeing the same wheels that we used to in regards to it would last up to the Valiant pick. And that's what leads to stuff like Valiant Lando and then insert Terra Captain here, which, you know, sometimes are rude and sometimes incorrectly Ogerpon, but we'll gloss over that bit. So I think Lando being at the same price of Tinglu makes a hell of a lot of sense at the minute. We also have Palafin here, and that's just because Palafin is a really weird mon in general, especially in the 8-mon format. Palafin is really tricky to get right, because obviously you need the turn to be able to get out to activate the form. And while yes, drafts don't really have natural water resists, and it does kind of force Terra Water a lot, it still feels like it's not offering a lot to a lot of the round 1 mons at the minute. So it's kind of really tricky to draft, especially at the price of 17. So I think a point reduction makes sense in this case. There is a case where maybe it could have gone lower, but I think anything lower and it becomes too good value. So 16 makes sense for now. Gouging Treads and Tinglu all survive in this tier. The 15-point tier also hasn't changed that much. There is a couple things I want to talk about here, and we'll start off with Pecharunt, because holy shit, Pecharunt in 13 is a crime. This mon is phenomenal. It is the best spin blocker in the tier. It is probably the best fat mon in the tier. It shuts down a bunch of teams by itself if you're not careful. Toxic plus Malignant Chain is dumb. Toxic plus Poison Puppeteer is fairly stupid. It can Parting Shot out to pivot. It can run fast Destiny Bond. It can go both physical or special due to its move pool. Nasty Plot sets can be really good. Recover obviously has reliable recovery, and it can Parting Shot out to pivot. I do think this mon is, like, we're seeing that this mon is a late round 2, early round 3 mon. And so I don't think 13 points is fair for that. So I've bumped it up to 15, and I said Petron should be 15 before DCL3, and I think DCL3 is only kind of exemplified exactly what I thought about Petront, so I'm doubling down on this opinion. I'm putting it in 15. The other mons that have jumped up into this tier are Cinderace and Dragonite, and that's just because they are the major standouts in the 14-point tier. Just to preface this, I'm actually just going to go over base prices up to probably about like 10. That was kind of where I made adjustments. I didn't make any major adjustments from like 9 and below, maybe like a couple based on usage stuff. So I'll mention them as well. And then I will kind of go on to Terra Captains, because Terra Captains is an entirely different discussion. And I think it just kind of ruins the flow if I go from one thing to another. We look at 14. I have dropped Galarian Slowking down, and I have bumped Jirachi up. Both of these things make sense. Galarian Slowking is not as good as Pecharunt. This is just a fact in the modern meta. And while yes, I do think G-King probably still had some usage in 15 if you wanted it, I think 14 just makes it a much more tempting price in comparison to just grabbing Pecharunt. Jirachi is also just the second best steal to draft easily. And while yes, Goldengo is a better mon, and that's why I've kind of kept Goldengo there, even though I did think about dropping Goldengo down. Only briefly, though. I think Jirachi, just the utility that it can offer, and the variety that it has, is just really good. And obviously Healing Wish is great. So I decided to bump that thing up a point. The 14-point tier remains unchanged otherwise. We then get to 13-point tier. Once again, not a crazy amount of changes. I've just added Iron Crown and Metagross to this tier. And that's because I think that they are a point worse than Jirachi, but on par with each other. And I think you're kind of noticing that it used to kind of be the order of Jirachi would go first, then it'd be Metagross, then it'd be Crown. But now it's Jirachi goes first, and Crown and Metagross are kind of interchangeable depending on what you need in the team. There's not quite the same clear order. We'll get back to talking about Iron Crown later for obvious reasons, as you can see. But I've decided to keep the two of these. Ooh, I kept Metagross Terra Price at 12 by accident. Good job, me. But these things are bound to happen when you make like 60 changes to a document, and you just kind of have a narrow oversight. Oh well. 12 points, nothing much to write home about. Yeah, the only thing I moved here was actually Orgapron Cornerstone. And that thing deserves to move because that thing's amazing. Like, who knew that reliable Rock Stab with an incredible amount of utility and a good speed tier would lead to a good mon? Then you have 11. Hi, Almamola. You definitely could have been 12, but I decided to be nice and only bump it up 1 point rather than 2. We all know what the Wish Fish does. Well, it's not even the Wish Fish anymore. It's just the Flip Turn bot that clicks Healing Wish sometimes. Thanks, Who. You've all ruined this fish for us. Well, I say ruined this fish for us. I think we all preferred when the fish wasn't really seeing play. Now it's just flip turning on everything and making lives miserable. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also swapped Necrozma and Mew, because Mew is just a better mon than Necrozma. Like, that's not hard. This also definitely could have been 12, but, whatever. Mew is just a better mon than Necrozma. It has far more options on both the physical and special side, as well as having the utility. So I think it makes it. I don't agree with Necrozma being above Mew, so I've swapped them. And then the last thing of note in this tier is I've moved some steel types up. Two of them being Tinkaton and Corviknight. And these are the next best steals, and I think it makes sense for them to not be in the same tier as Cobalion. So Tinkaton, great utility, really good for the Masquerada matchup. Has weird offensive potential in matchups sometimes. Good screen setter, reliable rocker, good typing. Isn't a Klefki. So I think it makes sense for this to move up. And Corv is also just another one where, it is probably the most reliable defogger and also has similar utility. Iron Defense Body Press can also be good in particular matchups. It can shut down a lot of the physical threats that you see at the top of the board, unless they're like specifically catered towards it, which can happen sometimes. But, kind of forcing that, I think, shows that Corv needs to be respected as a mon. So I felt that bumping the two of them up made a lot of sense. Then the 10-point tier, The most interesting thing to talk about here is the fact that I have all three Lake Spirits in here, which would be the first time ever that they're all the same value. But I think it makes sense. Yuxi, while yes, still has the same great utility as it does in every gen, this is the gen where it utilizes it the least. And I think that's just because it's really difficult to just put on a fat, pivoty psychic. And while yes, it did get some play in DPL just gone, Pardon the Eruption had a Yuxi squad that they just ran Scarf like most of the time. It was kind of insane. But it still did well on that team because it was just kind of an enabler to be able to get Terrachiyu in. But I still don't think that Yuxi is that great. And if you compare that to Mesprit, who is absolutely everywhere, oopsies, who is absolutely everywhere, has a similar level of great utility while having a bit more offensive prowess, and also access to Healing Wish, which is such a massive thing this gen when you have mons like Terrapagos, Terrazarude, and Terra Raging Bolt. Yeah, I think it makes sense that they're on par with each other. Azelf just hasn't moved from 10. There's nothing much to write home about there. And then the last thing I moved into this tier was Mandibuzz. Similar logic, it's one of the two actual reliable defoggers. I've talked about that already. So I think it makes sense that that thing gets a pump price rise from 9. And yeah, you can see I missed the Terra prices on both of them. Oh well. And then lower than this, there's the only thing of note is I bumped Cyclizar's price up 2 points because Cyclizar at 7 is far too cheap for the speed tier as well as the removal, access, and coverage. So yeah, it makes a hell of a lot of sense for Cyclizar to not be a 7-point mon. There's a reason it was the only thing below 10 points to get drafted in every single draft in DCL. And that just shows that it's too cheap. I did consider moving some other mons. Conkeldurr was one that kind of came to mind. I thought about raising that to 8. I did not. And I possibly could have dropped a few more mons in like the lower section here if I really wanted to. I didn't really pay enough attention in here to do that properly, but if people would be interested in that, do let me know. I might do it at another time. Because there possibly is a few interesting conversations in here. Just going back to those usage stats and seeing what low tiers are used and what low tiers aren't. Even though there's kind of no consistency in those anymore. There used to be a lot more. Anyways, enough of my rambling about regular prices. Let's talk Terra, shall we? So, aside from the two that I mentioned, which were the two 20-point Terras of Torn and Sneasler, it should be of no surprise that both Raging Bolt and Zarude are our two 19-point Terramons. Then in 18, we have Great Tusk, we have Ogerpon Wellspring, and I freed this thing. Now, this is probably also slightly divisive, but I do want to explain my logic on this. Terra Regieleki is a good mon. That can't be denied. It definitely has a slightly unhealthy aspect to it in regards to it just runs boots in every matchup and forces very specific positioning. But it does kind of falter to Terra Electric, where all it's kind of doing is pivoting out and being a nuisance. And I don't think it's worth banning just for the sake of being a nuisance. A lot of the grounds as well also beat it, unless it is in like various different capacities, whether that just be through towering out of the ground type if you're 4 times weak to anything in particular, or just packing the right resist berry, or assault vest in the case of stuff like treads. So I just think Regieleki just isn't quite as good now as it hypothetically would have been a year ago. And are you really going to pay 18 points for a Terramon where all you're going to do with it is like set screens, maybe rapid spin sometimes, Terra Normal Explosion to get a kill on a spinner, or like a defogger? I don't know. But I do think Regieleki would be... It is a very good revenge killer though in this metagame. And I think having that level of revenge killer could be kind of nice. So I would be interested to see how it does. It could go one of both ways. Like, it could just hit a point where someone is a really nice Regieleki draft and it just works an absolute treat. Or it goes horribly wrong. I really don't know. So let's scroll away from the 6-point tier. That is the last time you will see this far left of the board. For good reason. And then it's from 17 onwards. Well, 17 onwards, I think I only have Gren in 17. Oh no, I have Enam in 17 as well. I dropped Enam a point because Enam is just very difficult to draft around. So I think it makes sense. 16 and 15 is kind of where things get the most interesting. I've kept Chiyu as is. I think that's fair. I have bumped Urshifu Rapid Strike. Sorry, I've kept Urshifu Rapid Strike as is. And the most interesting bond I've put in the 16 is Iron Moth. And the reason is I'm kind of sick and tired of this thing being 14 and getting constant usage. We all know how the Iron Moth drafts go. It is super consistent at what it does. It is a variety of options. And we're kind of even seeing more options lately with the introduction of like the fatter U-turn sets that we're seeing more and more as particularly this DCL goes on. So I think 14 is far too cheap for this thing. And I think 16 might be a little steep, and I might be slightly biased because I'm sick and tired of seeing this thing's usage be the same, and people are just like, yeah, just keep it the same price. So I do want people's opinions on this because it might be a little bit of a knee-jerk, and maybe I should have just bumped it up to 15. But some of the ones I have in 15, I do think Moth is slightly more consistent than in terms of draft rate and in terms of usage and like win percentages. So yeah, let me know on this one. Also in 16, I've lowered Iron Boulder. Iron Boulder was not getting usage at 17. You know, it was doing really well a year ago, but a lot changes in a year, as we kind of talked about last week with Terra's Rude. And Boulder is in the exact same category. And I've also put Blaziken here. And that's because I think Blaziken's a phenomenal mon. I just think it's really difficult to draft around. And I think that's the common opinion amongst a lot of people. So lowering it down, making it that slight bit easier to draft to give people more options, I think would be really cool. And I think at this price, a hell of a lot more people would consider it because I also think 15 would be too low. I think 16 is the right place for it. So that's why I have it there. Then we go to 15. Obviously, Petrant has to be there. Goldengo's there. I didn't even talk about Terra and Treads, who would. Zapdos. And then in terms of some more mid-tier mons that I'm sick and tired of kind of not being used. Well, I say not being used too much. We have Iron Crown at 15. This is my other 2-point buff. I think Terra Iron Crown is super good the way it is at the minute. Variety of sets because of the booster speed potential, you have the agility potential, you can just break with Terra Steel Tachyon Cutter, even Assault Vest and just like defensively Terra to be able to deal with specific threats. This thing just utilizes Terra really, really well. So I think 15 is a fair price. It is also joined by Keldeo because, Terra Keldeo is good to the shock of absolutely nobody. So, its Terra Stabs are good. It can run Stab Terra Blast. It's one of the few mons that I think can utilize Terra Stellar well in particular matchups. Zarude and Hydrapple are kind of the main two that come to mind. Raging Bolt too to an extent, but just because I Combine Bolt, that doesn't really happen. I have dropped Terra Quackable down to 15 as well. I think Terra Quackable and Terra Keldeo are on par and are both worse than Terra Rapid Strike. So I think it makes sense to have Quackable in 15. Then, did I put anything else of interest into 15? Why is Galus? Galus Loki does not need to be there. Terra type 15 points, but whatever. Oh, I've also moved Ogerpon, Terra Tealpon down a point to 15. That makes a hell of a lot of sense because Terra Tealpon is just not the same mon as it was because people draft Grass Resists and yeah, the utility is good and people are trying to use it for like mid-season pickups, but it's just not as good as it used to be. That's all it is. 14, not so much to write home about. I put Terra Mew here because Terra Mew is great, and yes, it's only really Flame and Castelia that I can think of that are having success with it. Addison used it well in the seasonal, like last year. But yeah, I think Terra Mew is super good, so I think 14 is a fair price. And I've also dropped Terra Mence down because Terra Mence just kind of fell off, and I'm not entirely sure as to why. So its point value does have to go down. Oh shoot, I missed some 15s. This video is all over the place. My bad, guys. But what did you expect from this channel? I've also put Terra Gliscor here to kind of round out the bunch of mid-tier Terras that are getting constant usage. And yeah, Terra Gliscor is super good because of the setup sets, or because it can Terra into better defensive typings and matchups to toxic stuff and get up spikes. Yeah, this thing utilizes Terra just phenomenally well. So I think a price hike from 13 makes a hell of a lot of sense. I think Moth plus Gliscor being a legal Terra combo is crazy. So I would rather that not be the case. And then I also moved Terrakin Gambit down to 15. You know, nobody uses Terrakin Gambit anymore. I potentially could have gone lower, but I decided, we'll just drop it a point for now. Possibly could have been 2, but I'm not quite sure what the point value is where you start getting Terrakin Gambit usage up again. It might be 14. It might even be 13 with the way I have this board. It kind of just depends on how other mid 2 Terra captains come into play. But the main thing that I kind of set out to do with this was to promote the variety in Terra mid tiers. Because what is happening at the minute is you are seeing constant Moth usage, constant Crown usage, constant Gliscor usage, and there's so many other interesting Terramons in the current metagame. Like, you look at Scizor, which I got rid of the Terra tax on. You look at Ursaluna, which I dropped the base price of and reduced the Terra cost of. You know, Thundy T. Saraledge is also another really good example. Terra Hydreigon, which we're seeing L5 using that quite well at the minute. Terracoma is also an interesting one. Just don't run Clangor Soul because Mirror Herb exists. Like, there's so many interesting Terramons that you can go for. And it just feels like everyone's going for the same, like, 3 or 4. And yes, Wake could have potentially been in that category, but I think because of the fact that Sun is... Like, Sun is not something you constantly see. I did also raise the price of Ninetales, by the way. I don't know if you guys saw that. Yeah, that thing's in 9 points. Shock. And yeah, it's just one of those situations where... Oh, I also lowered Urshifu Single Strike. I want to see more people trying to use that. Like, there's so many interesting Terramons that you can try, but everyone's just using the same, like, 5. So what I kind of wanted to do with that was raise the price of those 5 that are constantly getting used to make people think about it more. And I think that's something that makes sense, especially in an event like a seasonal. And that is kind of it when it comes to interesting Terra prices. And if there is any other kind of... In terms of unbans, there was a couple more I thought about. And I thought about Volcarona briefly, but I decided that that thing is probably too oppressive, just due to its setup potential being relatively unfair, and also Flame Body just being an easy out sometimes to its quote-unquote checks. Because if they get burned, it just doesn't do the same damage. You Morning Sun it off, and then you're just setting up even more and winning. So I think that was probably too much. The other one that I considered briefly was Terra Kyurem. And that's because I think Kyurem is the least broken of the Terra Dragons. Well, yeah, I think that's correct. I think that's correct. Because all the rest of them are bloody ridiculous. And I thought Kyurem was potentially the most allowable, but I also think that would be far too centralizing in the metagame at the minute. So it's probably best to leave it as is. So that's why I only freed Sneezing and Blood Moon. And I guess the final thing to address here is my opinion on sleep, which is the one other remaining conversation that is being had around this season. For me, I do think that there's nothing inherently wrong with getting rid of sleep. And that is because sleep doesn't necessarily benefit anything in the metagame, because we don't have as many mons that rely on Yawn as we do in past gens. And the reason for that is most of the mons that relied on Yawn get Encore. And they're stopped by the exact same thing, and you're better off with Encore than Yawn. Like, you just are. So, a lot of mons just don't use Yawn anymore. Sleep Pattern and Hypnosis just kind of force particular positions that are really unhealthy in a metagame that is this aggressive and this volatile as SV can be. So losing that turn because, a Darkrai hit a Hypnosis is potentially game ending, which I'm not entirely sure is the correct thing. I do think that there is a case for the idea of just complex ban Hypnosis sleep on Darkrai. But I'm not entirely sure it solves the problem because you still run into situations like Hisui and Lilligant, which I also bumped its terror price up, by the way. I don't know why that thing's 10 at the minute. And also like Hypnosis Ninetales, or just Hypnosis anything, because, you know, if Amon gets Hypnosis, Kaif's probably used it at least once. So, and Spore is not enough of a tool. Like, people are not using Amoonguss. Maybe, although maybe that is the next one up now that like Hydropolis had its moment, Alan has had its moment, and Toxapex is recently having its moment. I might need to do an entirely different video on the rise of the SV Pex. We'll see. Should have a lot more time in the coming weeks, and I am running out of ideas. So, I think I would be saying yes, get rid of Sleep, just to try it out for this event. And the only one that I would keep is Relic Song. And that is because, one, low percentage chance of happening, and two, I think it's unfair to completely ruin an entire, like, half of a Mon, in Maliway's case. Would be just a bit unjust. Anyways, that was 35 minutes of me giving my opinions ahead of the current seasonal. I'm definitely interested to see how the final tier list pans out for this event, and I know I'm going to have fun in it. Once again, just a reminder, I will leave the relevant links for the server as well as the signups in the description. And yeah, I really want this to kind of lead to discussions on opinions in terms of like the current SV metagame as we go into the seasonal. Yes, it is a little bit tricky seeing as we are still technically mid DCL and there's still time for things to kind of fluctuate a bit. But I think we've kind of seen the trends enough to be able to comment on it. So, and with this being the last season, I think it's interesting. I think it's an interesting idea to kind of spice things up a bit. That would be my opinion, especially when you're 3 years into a metagame. But you know, who knows how that'll actually go. Anyways, guys, I hope you all have enjoyed this ramble, and I shall catch you in the next one. Peace.